All right, welcome to week 10. This week we're closing our discussion of American federalism. Now, this might seem like premature closure, which is a term I learned from teaching my intelligence class, but in point of fact, this is a good time to finish up our overview of federalism. This is not, in fact, a course on federalism per se. It's a course on intergovernmental relations. So we're not just concerned with the fact that we have a federal system of government. We're also looking at how these separate branches of government interact with one another, cooperating and collaborating at some points, and engaging in more or less competitive behavior at other periods. Um, Robertson's final chapter begins with a discussion of immigration and the rise of immigration laws regulating how many immigrants are allowed into the country. What factors initially spurred the passage of federal immigration laws? Robertson also briefly discusses the rise of the Know Nothing Party, which had a brief run as the third party but fizzled out just prior to the Civil War. What kinds of people joined the Know Nothing Party? What issues caused a person to become a Know Nothing as opposed to a Democrat or a Whig? Where did the Know Nothings go when their party failed? Um, an issue, that really kind of drives me on the notion of immigration, the whole issue of immigration is, does American immigration law have essentially racist origins? And even if we scourge all the racist implications from existing law, would we not have to worry that quotas are innately racist in their results? Uh, how would you revise U.S. immigration laws? What would you do regarding the millions of undocumented immigrants currently living and working in the United States? Related to the issue of immigration are the 330 or so sanctuary cities in the U.S., where municipal officials have effectively banned local police from cooperating with immigration officials to identify and remove undocumented immigrants. How are sanctuary cities even feasible under our Constitution, given that municipal governments effectively lack constitutional authority? The answer to that question is federalism, right? Just about all sanctuary cities are located in states where Latinos are a crucial part of the electorate. Think Illinois, think California, think New York. Uh, that means that most sanctuary cities are located alternatively in blue states or states that are fairly purple. And the Supreme Court has clearly ruled that municipal officials are not mere chattel to the federal government, and they can't be dragooned into doing something that they don't want to do. The decision there, Prince versus the United States, a 1997 decision, was actually a decision written by Antonin Scalia. And again, it reflects that idea of federalism, right? That the two governments, that the federal government and the state governments are separate and co-equal. The federal government does have the supremacy clause working in its favor, but that doesn't mean that they can simply convert the state governments into mere adjuncts of the federal government. The remainder of this chapter is sort of a recapitulation of the historical factors that have shaped American federalism, as well as a discussion of how federalism has shaped history in turn. To no small extent, federalism was a mechanism established by the Constitution framers to act as a kind of negotiated sovereignty. Ideally, policymakers at the state and federal level would communicate with one another and determine reasonably which level of government was best suited to respond to a particular issue. What we have learned, of course, over the course of the semester so far is that while there's a good bit of negotiation and compromise, at times negotiation breaks down and instead we get conflict. Robertson notes that there have been numerous layers of policy added to federalism over times that has shaped the way federalism behaves in certain periods. So you have intense reform-minded movements that have used federalism strategically to jumpstart state policies onto the national agenda. The three periods where federalism was most altered, the Progressive Era, the New Deal, and the period of liberal activism, all made enormous changes to the practice of American federalism. In particular, the last phase of liberal activism introduced an adversarial element that previous eras had lacked. Where progressives and New Dealers attempted to include the states in government reforms, the reformers in the liberal activist period concluded that most state governments, or that many state governments, would oppose the attempts to combat poverty and consequently they attempted to bypass the states and inject resources directly into large urban cities where they perceived the problems to be particularly bad. They in the Johnson administration they called this the George Wallace problem. You know, when they proposed a solution, you know, the proposed policy, someone would say, "Does anyone think the governor from Alabama is going to go along with this?" And so, yeah, well, probably not. The result was to stoke resentments, and of course, George Wallace's campaigns for the presidency were great reminders of just how powerful resentments were even in the 1970s. And that fueled a perception that the federal government was favoring poor minorities over whites, over poor whites, who were also struggling, albeit in more rural environments. Those resentments fed a resurgent conservative movement dedicated to the idea that the federal government had grown too powerful and that power must be returned to the states. That's really where we are today. I mean, I spent time in a very small, low population state where the attitudes toward the federal government were absolutely just uncompromisingly hostile. So how do liberals and conservatives view federalism? And how do they employ federalism as both a sword and a shield, to use Robertson's metaphor? What issues have liberals generally felt should be national issues? And which issues do they believe should be left up to the states? Which issues do Republicans want to push to the national level? And which issues do they think are best left up to the states? One important takeaway from this chapter and over the course of this book is that both liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans, use federalism strategically, and no one cherishes some consistent adherence to federalism as part of its ideology. All sides employ federalism strategically and pragmatically, calling for adherence to federalism when it advances their preferred policy outcomes, but cynically jettisoning any notion of federalism when it complicates the achievement of some desired aim. So, does federalism consistently support democracy? Clearly, the record is mixed. It tends to be mixed in other countries as well. Nations tend to adopt federalism because they lack the homogeneity that historically has formed the basis for nation states in Europe. It's a coping mechanism. And as a coping mechanism, it can have favorable and unfavorable implications for democracy. Federalism is respectful, at least in theory, of local majorities, but at times federalism causes a blindness to local majorities' discrimination against unpopular minorities. Robertson concludes this chapter with a discussion of certain reforms that he believes will strengthen American democracy. Automatic voter registration is one. The removal of secretaries of state from partisan elections, and we actually have two secretaries of state in Georgia and Kansas, where the Secretary of State is acting as Secretary of State and also running for governor, which strikes me as a huge conflict of interest. Removing that position from partisan elections, and then the imposition of nonpartisan or bipartisan legislative redistricting to try and get rid of the gerrymandering problem. Let's discuss the pros and cons of these reforms, along with our overall impressions of Robertson's book. I think, was this a good read? I think it was. I love it. I think it's a great book. Did Robertson help you understand how primordial federalism is for American federal government? If so, then I think that it was a good choice for me, and I certainly intend to keep using it unless I get some clear direction from the class that it wasn't a very good book. But in any event, I think this we should have a good basis for discussion based on what I've covered to this point, and let's have a good week.